Well, hello, everyone. Bill Sherck, the man about the woods. Welcome to the Minnesota Bound podcast, the stories behind the stories. I am just home starting to clean up after a big trip to Montana. We got out there just one day after the blizzard hit, and it's a good thing I had mud tires on the truck because all that snow we got melted. Roads were muddy. We had a remote camp set up, so all the tarps and tents are hanging in the outpost right now, drying out. It's good to be home after putting almost 2,100 miles on the truck this past week. So quite a trip. The good news, I'm home. The bad news, I won't be out for the Minnesota Deer Opener this year. Too much going on with family and hockey practices for the kids. So I won't be in the woods, but of course, a lot of other people will be. And I'm going to share one of my favorite deer camp stories of all time today as part of the Minnesota Bound podcast. And I think you'll get a real kick out of this story, and it's a pretty emotional tale, too. Before we get to that part, I want to make sure to thank all the folks that help us get the Minnesota Bound podcast on the air each week. Of course, the Stories Behind the Stories is presented by Connecticut Water Treatment Systems. You know, my family uses Connecticut, and you should too. Don't forget Star Bank. It's the bank we use at Minnesota Bound. And then our good friends over at North Dakota. Plan all your fall hunts in North Dakota at legendarynd.com. And for sure, our natural resources friends here in Minnesota, I'd like to thank the Minnesota DNR. Okay, it's time to get to the story. Of course, Minnesota's gun deer opener kicks off at the beginning of every November, and I would argue outside of the Minnesota Walleye opener, it is the biggest outdoor celebration or outdoor holiday we have here in the state. A couple of numbers for you kind of really sum up what the hunting season is all about. Deer hunting fans, how much money do you think they put into our economy each year? The number actually is $725 million a year. About $235 million of that is related to things like food, lodging, and transportation. But deer hunters tend to be gear junkies, right? $400 million a year on equipment, and then another $90 million on things like hunting magazines, memberships to conservation organizations, licenses, all that stuff. And then the last curious fact that I really like, deer hunting is responsible for about 3,760 jobs here in Minnesota. And that is according to the Hunting in America report. So good stuff. It's a big weekend, and it's big about tradition, right? Families getting together in their annual camp, fathers taking sons and daughters, wives involved in the hunts. And the traditions are always so big every season. If you haven't deer hunted, it's hard to describe until you do it. To get up on opening morning in the dark, to settle into a stand. And my favorite part is maybe that echo you start to hear. Once the light comes, critters are moving around the woods, and there's that echo in the distance of gunfire. It's such a gentle, soft sound, just that echoing through the woods. It's one of my favorite parts of being out there on opener. But the other part for me is at Minnesota Bound, we try and gather stories every year around opener. And today I want to talk about a story I gathered. It's been 15 years ago already, but it seems like we were in the Slick family deer camp just yesterday. And it is probably the opener story that best defines what we try to do with our storytelling. I had taken a note from the Slick family. They are up around Lake of the Woods, and every year they've got like 4 dozen family members that show up in the family camp. And at that time, they had 300 and I don't know, 60 acres, something like that for the family to hunt on. Um, it was the land of Kai Slick. Kai had come home from the war and had always dreamed of having a spot to hunt. And as he told me, a friend of his was down in Minneapolis, and Kai had his eye on this chunk of property. And his buddy said, "Tell you what, I'll buy you the property, but here's the deal. I get to log it one time. And after I log it, it's your deer camp." And Kai said, "Well, geez, that's a deal you can't beat, right?" Um, so the Slick family deer camp started a long, long time ago, right? And it's been a legacy for the family ever since. And if you're up in that neck of the woods, you know the Slick family name. So we got invited up to the family deer camp for a very special reason, having to do with Kai's son, Robert Slick. So Cy Dotson was the photojournalist who accompanied me on that trip. And that was actually early in Cy's career with Ron Sherck Productions. So he was kind of new to shooting up in deer camp. So we arrived up on Friday, kind of midday, um, to the Slick family camp. And it's such a neat spot. They're just kind of out on the edge of the bogs up there. In northern Minnesota, and they had several cabins placed. It was funny because when you look at the insulation inside the cabins, at least one of them, I might call it a bunkhouse almost, had old newspaper for insulation, right? That's nothing new. A lot of the old structures in Minnesota, they used to crumple up newspaper and put it in the walls. But when you looked at the dates going way back in time in the yellowed papers, it just, as soon as we saw that, we thought, man, this is going to be a special camp, um, for very good reason. So we settled in. They cooked a little dinner that night. There was a little light snow going. Again, you've got 40 some family members, right? You've got the old timers. You've got um, the grown sons. You've got the grandchildren. So you've got some kids, some younger hunters running around camp. It was really just kind of the perfect scenario. And under the lights, they were outside frying fish for that pre-opener meal. And as the snow started to fall, I was setting up a tent out away from the cabins, a little personal tent. And photographer Cy came over. He's like, "Hey man, what are you doing? What are you doing?" I said, "Well, when I come to these camps, I always just set up sort of away from the fray." He's like, "It's gonna be cold tonight. You're nuts, man. What are you doing?" And more of that story to come. But I got set up, got my sleeping bag in, and one thing leads to another. Night comes, right? They've got to get up and hunt before sunrise, so we all settle in for the night, and we get a little rain, we get a little sleet. I slept like a baby. Um, and we headed out the next morning just to get some shots of the family members in their tree stands. Um, and Cy looked at me and said, "Dude, I understand it. I know why you bring the tent." I giggled a little bit. I said, "Oh." So Cy slept in the main bunkhouse, which was, I think, 29 of the Slick family members, most of them grown men, some of the older guys. They had put Cy in the top bunk next to the barrel stove. So in that top bunk, it was about 99 degrees. And he also noticed that there was a laundry line hanging above the barrel stove. So he literally had socks hanging on the line, tickling his nose all night uh, from all the camp members. And after that, so I always brought a sleeping bag and a tent and never stayed in deer camps after that. Um, but to the core story of why we wanted to shoot the Slick family camp. Robert Slick who was Kai's grown son, was back in deer camp for the first time. He had been away for a couple of years. He had actually gone into a coma a couple of years before. As the family described it, Robert got water in his brain and went away. He was out, not for weeks or months, but a long time. Um, and they told us a story about Robert being in a hospital bed, motionless. And the doctor had actually talked to the family and said, "It's time to move on. It's time to move on. He may not be coming back." And they told a story about one night, Robert's wife had been out to a fish fry. And she came to the hospital after to visit Robert. And she had leftovers, a little leftover fish. I feel like they were fried walleye fillets, in those little white foam take home deals from restaurants. And she sat that down next to Robert's bed and she just was there. And all of a sudden, this hand moved towards the walleye fillets. Robert was coming out of the coma after months and months and months. Long story short, he rehabs and eventually is well enough where he can get back to deer camp. So we were there to see Robert for his first hunt back in camp. And it was not a story about Robert being in the tree stand. It was about him being in camp and what he wanted to do, to say thanks to all the people who had nursed him back to health. So mid-morning, the hunters all came back in. Yeah, some had shot a couple of deer, but again, that wasn't really the point of why we were there in camp. They started working on a meal. Everyone was back in camp. They had flannel rolled up on their arms. They were pumping fresh water. They were peeling potatoes. They were prepping venison. And it was amazing because of how hard all these family members were working, with Robert and his dad Kai sort of directing the orchestra here as they worked in the kitchen. And Cy and I were just gathering as much content, shooting as many pictures, talking to as many people as we could, because we knew something big was about to happen in this deer camp. And we didn't completely understand until, it must have been, I don't know, 1, 2 in the afternoon. All these family members have been cooking. We're in this remote deer camp out in the middle of nowhere in northern Minnesota. And all of a sudden we hear engines coming. We hear trucks headed towards camp. Cy ran outside with camera, got set up. I peeked out the door, and all of a sudden we saw buses coming around the corner through the woods. And we realized, aha, this is what the story's all about. Okay. More on the Slick Family Camp in just a second, but first I want to thank all the sponsors who make the Minnesota Bound podcast happen. First and foremost, our good friends at Connecticut. My family loves Connecticut water. It's no secret there, right? I've been talking about Connecticut for years. We live in the country and we have plenty of that ironclad well water. That is good news and bad news, right? Well, we treat all of our water with Connecticut's whole home water treatment system. And we also use Connecticut's K5 drinking water system. That white buildup you get around your faucets at home? Well, we get none of that. Our dishes are spotless. My wife Katie loves what the Connecticut water does for her hair and her skin. And probably the coolest part for us as a family is our boys love to drink water. They don't go for the soda. They go for the K5 tap water all day long. They even fill all their water bottles before hockey and soccer practices. I'd say that's about as good as it gets. For me personally, that well water taste and that foul smell, guess what? It is completely gone. Trust me, call Connecticut like the Shercks did, and you should be able to look forward to clean, safe water. Connecticut, thanks for your sponsorship. Also, a big thanks to our friends at Star Bank.
Hi there, Ron Shera here for Star Bank. If you're putting your money into mega banks down the street, who knows where that money's being used? It's time to make the switch. Bank locally. Keep your money local with a community bank that actually cares about you, your family, your business, and your goals. Let me give you some advice from personal experience. Check out the bank we use at Minnesota Bound. Try Minnesota's own Star Bank. You can find them online at starbank.net. When you call Star Bank, you actually hear a real living person answering the phone. Star Bank has 10 convenient locations around Minnesota to serve you and all the mobile banking products that you need to manage your money. From Maple Lake to Elbow Lake, Eagle Bend to Eden Prairie. Check out all that Star Bank has to offer at starbank.net.
North Dakota is another of our key sponsors who help make this podcast happen. You know, I'd like you to consider visiting North Dakota this hunting season. Be warned, be prepared to bag your limit this fall. Right now, the pheasants are calling. You know, all year long, the state has reported that the ringneck pheasant crowing counts would be up this year. And the official numbers came in at the end of the summer, and the crowing counts are up like 15%. And now that the hunting season is underway, the bag reports are showing exactly the same. A lot of hunters are reporting getting limits of roosters this year. Of course, there are a lot of sharp-tailed grouse out in North Dakota too, you know, and maybe that's why North Dakota is such a favorite destination of ours here at Minnesota Bound. Also, don't forget North Dakota's central region. That is prime habitat for hunting waterfowl, and that season is here. North Dakota, where people are friendly and the hunting is better than good. It is great. Visit legendarynd.com and plan your next trip. Finally, I'd like to thank our friends at the Minnesota DNR, the Department of Natural Resources.
I want to talk about Minnesota's wildlife management areas are a vast array of lands across all of Minnesota. And these 1,440 Minnesota wildlife management areas are valued for not only wildlife, but Minnesota's outdoor recreation opportunities. For those of you that don't know, the Minnesota DNR maintains hunter walking trails. They plant food plots for wildlife and develop acres and acres of prairie and grasslands. To find out more about Minnesota's wildlife management areas, go to www.mndnr.gov/WMAS.
Okay, we've got the business out of the way. Now back to the storytelling. So, quite a few years back, photographer Cy Dotson and I traveled way north up towards Baudette, Minnesota, up on the Canadian border to visit the Slick family deer camp. We get to camp and we're there to shoot a story about Robert Slick, son of Kai Slick, who is was the grand poobah of the Slick family camp and the 40, 45, 48 hunters that visit the camp every year. Robert had been in a coma for like 2 years. Unbelievable. And just one day suddenly came out of coma, was folks at the rehab center up there got him back to good health, and Robert was in deer camp. So we were there for his first camp back. And he wasn't so interested in the hunting part of the game. He was in camp to say thanks. So again, the hunters went out on opening morning. They all come back. They get to work cracking away on this massive lunch, more like a Northwoods feed. And Cy Dotson and I are gathering this story, trying to figure out what in the world is going on when all of a sudden we hear vehicles approaching camp. So we run outside and start shooting. And here come these two buses meandering down the 2-rut road through the poplar and birch trees into the Slick family deer camp. They're buses from the local nursing home or rehab facility. Robert felt compelled to thank all the professionals who helped nurse him back to health after coming out of his coma. And they wanted to cook a venison meal for all those workers. Great idea, but the Minnesota Health Department puts the kibosh on it and says, well, you can't bring food like that into a nursing home facility. So the Slick said, well, to heck with that. Then we're going to do it our way. We're going to bus every worker and every guest at the nursing home facility out to the Slick family deer camp. And we're going to create the biggest, baddest Northwoods lunch they could ever dream of. So Kai and Robert are standing at the front door as these people are getting off the bus, some in good health, some needing a walker or a wheelchair to get around. And with such absolute grace, the Slick family sits all of these people down at tables in the dining room of the main cabin, and one by one, they bring each person out this heartfelt venison meal. And these people sat and they talked, and these seniors laughed, and the family interacted, and there were hugs, there were tears, there were smiles. And for 2 hours, Cy Dotson and I just gathered as much as we possibly could, watching this unbelievable moment unfold in deer camp. And you look back at that story and you say, that is exactly what Minnesota is about. I'm not going to use the cliche Minnesota nice, but it's the passion of which families want to share deer camp traditions. You know, for a lot of the people that came from the nursing home, they had grown up locally around that part of Minnesota, northern Minnesota. A lot of them had grown up on venison, not as a deer camp celebration, but as a way of life, right? Venison was how families fed themselves a long, long time ago. So it was really, really a special moment. Cy and I, in the end, got back home. We put this story together. It was a very magical piece. We were lucky enough to receive some accolades in the television industry for the story. And I think the whole thing culminated for me a couple months later. I was stuck on an airplane in a snowstorm in Detroit, American Airlines. I remember it so well. You know, you hear those terrible stories where you sit for hours stuck in an airplane on a taxiway. Well, that was me. And I think we were like 3.5 hours into sitting on the airplane and my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I picked up, and it was Robert Slick's family calling to tell me that Robert had had another stroke. Something had happened. And for me, it was a very poignant moment. It was very emotional. But I thought to myself, we got Robert's story. We did it. We got to him in time. And for those of us at Minnesota Bound to tell stories, that is why we're in this business. To me, these are the best, most compelling stories around. And I got to Robert's story in time before it was too late. That's why we do Minnesota Bound. That's why we put stories on the air. If you get a chance, you can look up Deer Camp and Minnesota Bound online, and you can find not just the Slick family camp story, but all kinds of other stories that we have documented in some of our favorite camps over the years. And I love all of them. But if nothing else, I hope that story helps you get ready for time in the woods with your family this year, whether it's in deer camp, whether you're just out camping, whether you're going to your favorite cabin or fish camp. Enjoy those moments because they are so special. So there you go. Thanks to the Slick family. That was quite a tale we shared. Well, it's time to get out into the deer woods. So I'm hoping you will have fun with your family. In the meantime, I want to thank a few of our sponsors who help make the Minnesota Bound podcast, the stories behind the stories, happen each week. Of course, the podcast is presented by Connecticut Water Treatment Systems, Connecticut Clean, Safe, Great Tasting Water. Connecticut Clean, Safe, Great Tasting Water. Also, our good friends at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. And don't forget North Dakota, where you can plan your fall hunts. North Dakota at legendarynd.com. And of course, we won't forget our good friends at Star Bank, the bank we use at minnesotabound.com. Hey, be safe out in the woods. Enjoy your family traditions. And until next week, don't forget to introduce a kid to the great outdoors. So long.